Okay, so now that we have the background information for the Declaration of Independence, the idea of natural rights and social contract theory, we can now take a look at the argument of the Declaration of Independence is actually relative. The argumentation, the Declaration of Independence has a major premise, a minor premise, and then a conclusion. We can start with the conclusion first. The conclusion of the Declaration of Independence is actually not that surprising. The conclusion is that we, the American colonies, the rule of the British government, and therefore we are independent of the British government. And so that's the conclusion. The Declaration of Independence signals in the title of its paper what its conclusion was: independent. And so how do they reach that conclusion? The major premise of the Declaration of Independence is contract theory and natural rights. They say that there is a contract that exists between we the people and our government, and that comes from the idea of natural rights. If all men are created equal, we have a contract. Furthermore, it establishes in a clear way what the job of the government is. The government must do at all times, it must protect our rights to life, liberty, and in the Declaration of Independence, pursuit of happiness. The original idea would be life, liberty, and property, but in the Declaration of Independence was life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the Declaration of Independence. And many people actually then, when I do this in terms of having more interaction than the lecture class, I will ask people, well, what's the minor premise of the Declaration of Independence? And um, some people have trouble identifying what that is. And the minor premise of the Declaration of Independence is actually most of the Declaration of Independence. It's the stuff we might not necessarily quote nearly as much, but it is something that is critically important. And the minor premise of the Declaration of Independence is the proof government specifically has violated our rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so some people argue that you only need the minor premise, but if the minor premise doesn't have the major premise added on top of it, all it becomes is just a list of complaints that we had, things we didn't like that the British government had done. But in framing it in terms of the major premise, the idea of social contract theory, and that the contract has been broken because our natural rights haven't been protected by the British government, we now elevate our arguments to more than just complaining about the things the British government did. They taxed our tea, they didn't let us have westward expansion. We were getting nose to nosy, as another Schoolhouse Rocks talks about, because the British government wouldn't allow there to be western expansion. The blockades on different ports in New England and in Virginia and places like that made it hard for us to trade and things like that. All of those Declaration of Independence, they talked about the British government doing these things and all these inconveniences and all these things that they won't allow. But without the major premise, the minor premise is just a list of complaints. It's things we didn't like. And actually, that's the viewpoint of the British government. They said, well, you just don't like what's happening, and therefore that's why you're complaining. But the argument, the major premise, the idea of social contract theory and natural rights, adds in the specificity of saying the British government has violated or done these doing so, has violated our rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And once you have those, the major premise plus the minor premise, you get the conclusion. The conclusion is that we're independent of the British government. And so it's important to recognize, as I said before, it's not a legal document. We actually didn't become independent simply by signing that. We celebrate the independence. It's July 4th. And we'd like to celebrate that and should in many ways. And the argument that's put there is worth thinking about. But it wasn't until we actually had the official battles and the war was won in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War that we were independent. You know, it's also important to recognize a little bit more history is that Britain was not happy with the fact that they lost the Revolutionary War, and they certainly wanted us back. That's what the War of 1812 was, their attempt to take us back. The pressure that it put on us as we're trying to create a system of government. We recognized that it was an unsafe world, and it was unsafe because Britain was not happy and wanted to get its colonies back. But it's also important to recognize that the argument of the Declaration of Independence, worth studying and politically thinking about, create our independence directly or completely. It started the process, and the process was only successful on the battlefield, again, with the help of France and Spain, that they contributed to this. And so it's a complicated reason. We can't go through all the history, but it's important to recognize that. The other thing to recognize, not a legal document, because the Declaration of Independence does not say anything about what system of government would replace the rule under a British Crown and Parliament. There was no discussion of what sort of government we would have. And so therefore, in addition or separate from the Declaration of Independence, we had to come up with a system of government. We needed to create a system of government in order to move forward. And so that attempt, our first attempt at doing that, is called the Articles of Confederation. And so we're going to move on and talk about the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was our first attempt at a government. It was created in 1777, but it wasn't ratified until 1781. And so it points out the difficulties of coming up with this system. It was written in 1777, but it wasn't accepted by the colonies completely until 1781. So it took 4 years of negotiation to get this to be our official system of government. And so we want to talk a little bit about some of the key components of this first attempt at government, the Articles of Confederation. And we start with a couple of definitions, and then we move in and talk about the structure, since we're political scientists, or you're going to play it for a little bit, institutions, the rules of the game, and we're going to talk about why the rules of the game were particularly difficult to solve some of the key problems that were facing our country at that time. So the Articles of Confederation, a perpetual union, ironically, it's called perpetual union, and yet it didn't last very long. So it came into force in 1781, and by 1787 we came up with a U.S. Constitution. But some of the definitional things we want to start with is that what the Articles of Confederation created was a representative government. We've already come across that in Chapter 1, and so what we said is that we have a republic. We have a representative government. We do not have a monarchy. We have left that system. We do not have a king. We don't have an American king. We will elect individuals who make decisions on our behalf. At the same time, we also don't have direct democracy. And so a republic, as your textbook talks about both in Chapter 1 and particularly in Chapter 2, this idea of a republic has some elements of democracy in that we have to have elections in order to have representatives who make decisions on our behalf. But at the same time, it is not the same. Some limits on what we can do. But at the same time, it said we're not a monarchy, and so it took that off the table. So we're not a monarchy, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. We have representative government, those representatives make decisions on our behalf. The other thing is the idea of a confederation. The idea of a confederation is one that is critical to understanding how the system of government under the Articles of Confederation started and how it was going to work. Confederation is a loose affiliation of states where each state maintains control and sovereignty. They were allowed to do whatever they wanted. So North Carolina could do whatever it wanted, New York could do whatever it wanted, Virginia could do whatever it wanted, Pennsylvania. We don't have to list all 13 of them. The 13 colonies became 13 states, and each one of those states had complete sovereignty, complete monopoly on power to decide what would happen to its territory and to its people. And so the foundation of that, and we're going to see that when we talk about the Constitution, the foundation, the unit that matters the most in the Articles of Confederation were the states. The states were the ones who had sovereignty. And the hope was those states would actually, that was not required. If states decided they didn't want to help their people, or they wanted to help some people more than others, that was up to them. But the foundation of the Articles of Confederation were states. And that's going to matter because in order to have the U.S. Constitution, you had to replace the Articles of Confederation. And so the states under the Articles of Confederation, to agree to any changes, would have to agree to give up some considerable power that they liked. Now, there may be reasons why they'd be willing to give up that power, but they start out with a monopoly on power. The national government under the Articles of Confederation do those things that a supermajority would allow the national government to do. And even if it granted its authority for part of the time, those states could change their mind. So the supermajority that is needed for any action taken by the government, the national government under the Articles of Confederation, took 9 of 13 of the states to agree. So it's more than a simple majority. It would be 7. It took 9. And again, this emphasis on voting rules and things like that is something that political scientists do. I do want you to recognize that those are important, and so you should pay attention to those. We'll be talking about ideas of 2/3 to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution, 3/4 to ratify them. Here we're talking about the idea of a supermajority, 9 of 13 as opposed to 7 of 13. We're talking about ideas of unanimity. To change the fundamental rules of the Articles of Confederation took unanimous support. We're going to talk about that more specifically. But these voting rules matter. They indicate who has the authority, and it also will talk about how the different units are going to play that game. And so when you have a confederation, you had that the national government wasn't given specific things to do. You could say in the document, as it did, that you would have a national army, you would have a navy, you would have those things. But unless the states actually had money to pay for those things, for example, that army or that navy wasn't going to be successful. And so the Articles of Confederation wanted the states to be able to have the complete monopoly. And in order to do that, you had to set up the rules in a particular way to make that happen. But that's going to have an influence, as I said, because the states, in moving from the Articles of Confederation to the US Constitution, are going to, almost by definition, are going to have to lose some power. And in doing that, they have to see that it is worth giving to those things. But the other is that the states would play a particular role, and that led to problematic outcomes almost immediately. And so what we are going to do now is to move on and do a formal consideration of the formal document, the formal institutions and the decisions that are made under the Articles of Confederation.